Hey there, guys. Thanks for joining me. I hope all is well with you, and a very warm welcome to another Holy Shed. It's Lent, of course, which can mean different things to different people. I really like what an old priest friend said to me years ago about it. He said, I see Lent as a time to look after myself. I like that. It's good to have a time of the year when you focus especially on looking after yourself. But if you really want to get my take on Lent, you can hear my talk about it this morning at St Leonard's Church in Streatham. As soon as there is a link available for that, I will post it on Facebook. Anyway, through Lent in the Holy Shed, we're continuing the process of reflecting on my 1995 book, The Post-Evangelical, and we're thinking about the book both then when it was written and now, because the world has changed a lot. And because the book situated the phenomenon of post-evangelicalism within a wider cultural shift from modernity to post-modernity, I need to say a bit about that, about the wider situation, hopefully without gobbledygooking it all too much, although I'm afraid a little bit of jargon is necessary. Chapter 6 of the book, Let Me Tell You a Story, is really a good place to launch into this. We all love a story, don't we? So let me begin with something which you may have heard in part before. It's the story of Holy Joe's, the church in a pub which me and Pat set up and led through the 1990s. The reason for talking about this, is because Holy Joe's epitomised the post-evangelical process, which itself mirrored some of what was going on in the wider culture as post-modernity came to a head in that final decade of the 20th century. So here's a story within a story, very postmodern. This is a story about a man who never actually came to Holy Joe's and yet personified what Holy Joe's was all about. His name was Nick, and yes, I met him back in 1972 when I did have hair, although not as much as he had with his lovely long blonde locks. Nick was a beautiful man, a drummer in various bands from psychedelic rock to punk, but his life changed when he became a Christian through an American group from the States, which set up a community in London. It was part of the Jesus movement, and so their community was called the Jesus Family. I loved Nick as soon as I met him, right up to when I sadly took his funeral in 2010. He was gay, but once converted to Christianity, he lived in a state of, evangelical self-denial, you may say, trusting Jesus to make his attraction to men go away. Surprise, surprise, it didn't. So eventually, unable to live a double life, he came out, he left Christianity behind, and eventually trained as a therapist, became a very beautiful, handsome man. We didn't meet for years, but then, hearing that I was now gay friendly, he got in touch, and over dinner we renewed our friendship, exchanged stories, and hugged quite a lot. The next day, I received an email from Nick in which he wrote, I shudder as I look back on my fundamentalist days, but here I am now, a 53-year-old gay man, wondering if I can recover some of the passion I once felt about Jesus without denying who I am now. Our conversation, he said, left me feeling that maybe I can. And you know what? He did. The entire raison d'etre of Holy Joe's was to cater for people like Nick. And for 10 years, in a pub in South London, me and Pat listened over many pints of beer to unremitting stories of anger, hurt, disappointment and confusion, mopping up quite a lot of tears into the bargain. Holy Joe's was a safe pastoral space for disaffected evangelicals, but it was also a place of deconstruction of old evangelical certainties. It was also, by the way, the birthplace of the post-evangelical. For many folk, Holy Joe's was a last resort, a final throw of the dice before walking away from the church, and maybe Christianity altogether. Most of those who came were in their 20s or early 30s. A few, like me, were a little bit older. Some were pushy and hard to shut up, others were content to sit and listen. Some wanted heady discussion, others needed somewhere to vent their spleen. What Holy Joe's offered was a no-holds-barred space to discuss, debate, and argue about whatever it was about the church and Christianity that got their goat. There was no judgment passed on what was heard on the evening. There were no right answers imposed at the end of the evening. For some, it really did prove to be a last stopping off point before leaving the church, for the time being at any rate. But for many, many more, it turned out to be the much needed incentive to keep on journeying, and even a stepping stone back into church life. 6 or 7 people that I know of actually went on to be ordained as a result of it. So it was kind of a recruiting post for the Church of England. But in all of this, it was what I would call grown-up church. Perhaps the greatest virtue of Holy Joe's was the refusal to treat people as backsliders simply because they had doubts, or because they were angry or hurt, or because they found church boring, or because they didn't want to worship, or because they sometimes felt like throwing a Bible at the preacher. In fact, the assumption was that it would really be strange if we didn't feel those kinds of things at times. Holy Joe's epitomised a postmodern, post-evangelical journey of faith. But back to the bigger story of life in the modern world. What we call the modern era of human history began with the Renaissance and the 18th century Enlightenment. It birthed a new story, a narrative in which rationality replaced religious dogma and authority. It gave birth to critical thinking, and out of that science and then technology. Also, it gave birth to ideals of human dignity, democracy, unfettered progress and economic growth. It literally shaped the Western world for centuries, the world that most of us grew up in. But then, after 2 world wars, an environmental crisis, or the realization of that, also the realization that progress wasn't actually for everyone, that it had consequences for the earth, that capitalism had a huge underbelly of discrimination, that racism, patriarchy and colonialism were embedded in the structures of the modern world. Well, by certainly the mid-1960s, the whole modern progress project was beginning to unravel and was coming under fire from many quarters. And then by the 1990s, the unraveling of modernity as the road to paradise was just like everywhere, from the cloisters of academia to music and popular culture and art, etc., often expressed through irony, pastiche, suspicion of authority, and cynicism toward the establishment, and the vested interests that it was felt were embedded in the establishment, whether that was political, cultural or religious. Now this state of disenchantment filling the air throughout the 90s is what is called post-modernity. It's a point of deconstruction. We have to say also, without necessarily having a positive alternative to put in its place. Now, Holy Joe's was a melting pot for deconstruction, but in the context especially of Christian dogma and doctrine, which seemed to rely on old certainties that no longer made sense to people. And church structures and leadership also, which upheld those certainties, felt irrelevant, outmoded, useless, annoying, irritating, all kinds of things. Week after week at Holy Joe's, the narrative of modern evangelicalism expressed through doctrines and through the subculture of evangelicalism literally was taken apart, even as at the same time the wider narrative of modernity was unraveling in society all around us. And frankly, that process continues to this day. Much of the postmodern instinct to question and deconstruct continues within Christianity, but also within the wider culture too, and rightly so, I believe. But as the decades of the 21st century are unfolding, a different story is required, and a different story is beginning to open up. We seem to be experiencing, are you ready for another bit of jargon? A postmodernism, which actually is increasingly called metamodernism or beyond modernism. What is that, I hear you say? Well, the problem with postmodern deconstruction, as I've already hinted, is that left to its own devices, it descends into, well, just into cynicism, nihilism even, meaninglessness, which takes us nowhere at all. It's the stuff of good jokes and humour, but it doesn't really feed the soul. It doesn't take the human person forward very far when all the laughs have died down. So a new story is opening up, or rather really a bunch of new stories. Some people, for instance, want a more radical postmodernity in which the gods of the modern world, like capitalism, are finally laid low in order that the world can, it's thought hopefully, discover a more egalitarian way to be. You know, the climate crisis and global inequality fuel this impulse towards something more radical. Some people, on the other hand, want greater freedom for sexual and gender diversity to flourish, what's often called the more woke world. Others, reacting to and really against postmodernity, want to return to old familiarities and certainties, traditional values, as it's often put, and believe often that we need stronger leadership in order to recover this. And religion becomes part of this process too. Politicians, I observe, who have no, and not just in America but here too, politicians who have no particular sincere religious commitment are mouthing off quite a lot about the need to recover and re-establish Judeo-Christian values. What they mean by that is, we want an anti-woke world. And so Judeo-Christian values becomes a sort of gathering point for just basically conservative and often right-wing ideas and values. So basically, from these two directions, these two reactions, we have so-called culture wars, right? Populist nostalgia for a mythical golden age on the one hand, versus a hunger for progressive politics and social values on the other. And this is a battle that's playing out all over the place, in politics, in the media, in social media, hugely. It is the air we breathe. And whilst both of these instincts could be seen as metamodern, to use that phraseology, I think a more productive, more useful form of metamodernism is also beginning to emerge. This is the instinct that I recognise, which looks for a fresh way, a synergy, or it's often called an oscillation between some aspects of the modern world that have been thrown out in too much of a wholesale fashion. So there's a longing to say, hang on, we want some of that back here. Some of that big story of modernity still has got value, but it's not having it back as in a first naivete, just going back to that as it was, but to a reconfigured version of it with aspects of the postmodern critique thrown in and put together. Do you understand what I'm saying? Well, if all of this gets your head spinning, let's refocus directly on the Christian scene and how that's affected by all this cultural noise that's going on. In a way, we could say that the good and healthy metamodern longing is for some form of re-enchantment. Postmodernity was very much about disenchanting, a disenchantment with what went before in the modern world. Whereas I think that there are people now, and this is especially prevalent through surveys of the so-called Gen Z, people who were born from 97 onwards, where there's quite a lot of kind of more conservative attitudes emerging, but underneath of this, there's a longing for a kind of re-enchantment. We don't want all this cynicism and things that have just gone overboard. We want some more of a sense of meaning in life. I mean, look, I believe that the nostalgic idea that there was once a golden age, socio-politically or religiously, to which we can now return, is basically nonsense. In the political realm, making America great again, say, or making Britain great again for that matter, by taking back our borders or re-establishing our national identity, gathering under the flag, etc., etc., I think is basically a dream, or a nightmare, actually. I mean, which bit of America's or Britain's past was so great anyway? What are we talking about? The slaughter of American Indians, throwing them off their land, a colonialism in Britain that treated the world as a resource for us, shedding untold blood in the process? Of course not. Is that what we look to get a kind of return of? We surely need to progress to a world and into a world which is just and fair and compassionate for all. A world where nature is treated as part of us and us as part of it, and not as a commodity external to ourselves that we use for our own will and purpose. It's true that the Post-Evangelical represented a moment of disenchantment with traditional Christianity too, especially evangelicalism. But I'm encouraged, actually, as I reread the book, that I think it does contain quite a lot of vision of re-enchantment of Christianity, of trying to propose an expression of Christian faith that could take us beyond the disaffection and disillusion that many of us felt. The core message of the book is, in fact, aimed at the disaffected, to say to them, look, you don't need to walk away. Yes, there's an awful lot about Christianity that may, offend or disappoint or even enrage, but what we have experienced in it is not all bad. There are ways to reconfigure that message, to reinterpret it, to discover a fresh synergy between aspects of traditional faith and the knowledge and sensibilities of the world that we now inhabit. As I've said many times, I think living the Christian life is basically an exercise in hermeneutics. It's an exercise in reinterpretation, both allowing the world to shed light upon the text and the text to shed light upon the world. I always intended to write another book. I struggled to do it, actually, during the 90s. I think it was that second difficult album, the Post-Evangelical, went so far and wide that I was kind of a bit crushed at the prospect of trying to write a follow-up. But I always wanted to write another book, which was the other half. If this was a moment of disenchantment, then I wanted to write about a moment of re-enchantment. And it's interesting that in 2008, when Metamodernism was in full swing in wider society, that I felt this strong urge to write my book, Re-Enchanting Christianity, which was more of a synthesis of traditional, Christian ideas and doctrines with the challenges of living in the contemporary world. And I took that whole project further still in Black Sheep and Prodigals a few years later. What I'm saying in all of this is, when, as many people have, we become fed up with the inherited story or narrative of Christian faith, when we can't believe in it anymore, the answer is not to throw it in the bin and move on, but to find a fresh telling of that story, which rings true and feels authentic to us in our present situation. This is what I try to do week in, week out here in the Holy Shed. To use the current jargon, the Holy Shed is a form of meta-modern Christian faith, not throwing away Christian tradition, but trying to find a continuity with it in the world of now. And so there is this kind of oscillation between the two, not a seesawing, but more of a synthesis of the two. I talked about this in Re-enchanting Christianity, where I proposed that we should not see tradition as some kind of fixed entity, like a parcel that we pass down from one generation to the next, with the idea that we're supposed to keep it entirely as we received it and then expect others to do the same, and so it goes on, so that nothing really changes. That sounds too much like, in biblical terms, a man who is given a talent and is so afraid of messing it up and losing it that he buries it in the ground so that he can hand it back at the end of the day exactly as he was given it. No, 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 no. That is not what tradition should really be about. I believe we must take this treasury, this treasure of the gospel, and trade with it, as the parable suggests, in the marketplace of contemporary culture. Let it be changed and transformed along the way into the currency of the present time, and therefore bringing change and transformation to the contemporary world, so that the liberating, transforming message of God's love revealed in Jesus Christ can remain a force for good in the world, a force for transformation of the world. I think this is what also we tried to do in Holy Joe's. It's what I've tried to do ever since, as a chaplain in an AIDS hospital at the end of the 90s, as the Bishop of London's chaplain for the environment, as a parish priest for 19 years in North London, as a podcaster here in the Shed, as a chaplain to St Ethelburga's Centre for Reconciliation and Peace. There's a golden thread through all of these things. It comes from a great desire in me to trade with the talents, treasuring the core message of Jesus Christ and God's love, but applying, reapplying, and reapplying it, and allowing it to evolve in the process. Because that's what I believe faith is, a process, not a fixed entity, not a fixed destination, not a final product, not a bunch of static certainties, but a process whose energizing force is the Spirit of God. A process I want to throw myself into new every morning, don't you? I love the way, actually, that I ended chapter 6, this chapter we're thinking about. Can I say that I loved it when I wrote it? Well, I just did. And this is what I said. If I just pull it up. I said, I guess the problem is one of security. Because change always brings insecurity, doesn't it? Years back in the 70s, Alvin Toffler wrote a book called Future Shock, in which he was trying to define what he saw as an emotional and psychological condition called future shock, which was the fact that the world was changing faster than people could really process. And that's a deeply insecure place to be in. If that was true in the 1970s, by the way, how true is it today? But I think there is a problem of security. And when we feel insecure, we want to rush back for cover into the old certainties. But guys, that's no way forward. That's just parking up at the side and going nowhere. Anyway, come back to what I said. I guess the problem is one of security, but the time has come for us to climb out of the little boat of our settled certainties and join Jesus in walking on the waters of uncertainty and vulnerability. As the German ecologist Rudolf Barrow says, when the forms of an old culture are dying, the new culture is created by a few people who are not afraid to be insecure. Amen to that, I say. And we could equally say, when the forms of an old version of faith are dying and becoming irrelevant and set aside, the new story of Christian faith is created by a few people who are not afraid to be insecure, who will step out, put their head above the parapet, and say, we have to go forward. That's what progressive faith is about. And I think faith is, from the beginning, inherently progressive. It's just that people have turned it into something different. They have solidified it and fixed it and deep frozen it. And that's what, the Post-Evangelical was about in the early 1990s. But the process goes on year after year, decade after decade, generation after generation. So I'm going to leave that there for this week. If you want to, you could read the next chapter 7 before the next shed, and that'll give you a helpful background to stuff that I'm saying. So here is a prayer with a lovely picture of a sweet little boy. This is a prayer which I wrote called "The Joke Is on Me." My best glimpses of you are from the corner of my eye when I'm not looking, when my mind is on other things and you're furthest from my thoughts, because then, right there, in the most humdrum of times, something magnificently ordinary catches my attention, and my heart grins, not because you were there, but because you're always there. The joke's on me. Amen. I think that's a good prayer to take with us into Lent and think about it. Find a place of openness and focus to God in the world all around us, in people, in things, in creation, in ways that surprise us. Amen. Well, I want to just drink to that. So if you've got a drink, join me now. Raise a glass to all the newness and freshness of what God represents in the world. God, not only the creator, but the heart of the creative spirit to life, l'chaim. So there it is, guys. Thanks very much for being with me. If you like what I'm saying and doing here in the Holy Shed, you can support us. You can buy us a coffee. You just need to go to my coffee site or follow the link on the screen. And we're very grateful to all of you who do this, who support us by buying us coffees, as it were, or, supporting us in other ways. It's much appreciated. Now, just to emphasize the fact that we do now have a podcast version of the Holy Shed. And so for those of you or people who prefer to listen while they're in motion doing something else to an audible podcast, then that is now available, and you can find it in the usual ways. So there you go. This week I shall be leading a soul space on Thursday at 7 o'clock. It's on the subject of reboot, time for a Lenten restart. So it's a kind of Lent-oriented hour of lovely music, film clips, stories, poetry, and a bit of me. What more could you want? So if you can join us for that on Zoom, you'll find a link posted during the week on my Facebook. And there it is. Thanks so much for being with me. Have a great week. Be kind to yourselves, to the world round about you. Stay human. I'll see you soon, but I'll finish with this blessing. God grant us the serenity to live fully and generously through circumstances we cannot control. Hope to keep on imagining better times for ourselves and our world, and courage to change what we can instead of simply leaving it to others. Amen.